Victory did not arrive with cheers. It came with silence. Across an entire star system, the guns stopped firing not because peace had been achieved, but because there was no one left alive to continue the war. Cities burned without resistance. Vox channels howled with half-formed prayers and dying screams, then collapsed into static that echoed over fields of corpses. From orbit, the surface of once populated worlds glowed red, not with industry or faith, but with fires feeding on the dead. Within the hour, the Imperium declared victory. No parades followed. No banners were raised. No hymns echoed through cathedral streets. Instead, scribes adjusted casualty figures. Astropathic transcripts were sealed. Entire campaign logs were redacted, their content erased under inquisitorial authority. What remained was a single line in Imperial archives, cold, sterile, and utterly false. Successful compliance achieved. But this was not a triumph. It was an autopsy. Billions had died. Civilians who never knew why their skies burned. Entire Astra Militarum regiments vanished so completely that their designations were never reassigned. Space Marine chapters, forged to be immortal, were reduced to broken gene seed vaults and empty fortress monasteries. Titans, walking gods of the Omnisia, fell screaming into ruin, their machine spirits howling as they died. And still, the Imperium pressed forward. Because in the Imperium of man, victory is not measured by what is saved, but by what is destroyed. A world may burn, a sector may bleed dry, and humanity itself may be scarred beyond recovery, so long as the enemy no longer exists. This war achieved that goal. The enemy was annihilated so completely that even its name was purged from history. And that is why this campaign, this massacre, this atrocity beyond comprehension, is remembered not as a tragedy, but as the bloodiest victory in Imperial history. In the Imperium of man, victory is not a celebration. It is a calculation. It is written in ledgers older than most star systems, calculated by scribes who will never see the battlefields they condemn. Victory is not measured by lives saved, cities preserved, or future secured. Those concepts are relics of more hopeful age, an age long buried beneath ash and bone. In the Imperium, victory is defined by subtraction. The enemy exists, then it does not. Everything else is acceptable loss. Human life is the cheapest currency the Imperium possesses. 1 billion citizens are born every generation, raised to serve, to labor, to fight, and to die without question. Their names are never recorded beyond local tides. Their deaths are not tragedies. They are expected outcomes. An imperial world can lose half its population and still be considered productive. It can lose 3/4 and still meet its quotas. So long as the machinery of war continues to turn, the loss is justified. This is why casualties do not matter. Astra Militarum regiments are raised with the understanding that most will never return. Entire formations can be annihilated in a single engagement and replaced within months. Their banners reissued, their histories condensed into a footnote. Even Space Marines, genetically engineered demigods forged to be humanity's ultimate defenders, are not exempt. Chapters may be bled white, reduced to handfuls of survivors, so long as the strategic objective is achieved. Their sacrifices praised, then quietly archived, because the Imperium does not fight to win wars. It fights to delay extinction. Every campaign is waged with the knowledge that humanity is already losing. The galaxy is hostile beyond comprehension, teeming with gods, monsters, and empires that hunger for mankind's annihilation. Against that backdrop, morality becomes a luxury the Imperium believes it cannot afford. Compassion is weakness. Mercy is inefficiency. Survival demands brutality, and brutality demands sacrifice on a scale no sane civilization would tolerate. So the Imperium chooses survival over humanity every time. Worlds are burned to deny them to the enemy. Populations are purged to prevent corruption. Entire sectors are written off as acceptable losses if holding them would cost too much blood, or worse, too much faith. And faith must be preserved at all costs, because belief in the Emperor is the glue holding a dying species together. Truth, when it threatens that belief, is treated as heresy. This philosophy is why the bloodiest campaigns in Imperial history are remembered as successes, not because they were righteous, not because they were just, but because humanity endured, wounded, diminished, and forever scarred. The Imperium does not ask whether victory was worth the cost. It asks only one question: did humanity survive one more day? If the answer is yes, then no amount of blood is considered too high a price. Before the blood, before the silence, before the Imperium buried the truth beneath a mountain of lies, the sector was ordinary. That was its greatest crime. It was not a legendary battleground, nor a cursed frontier whispered about by navigators. It was a functioning imperial domain, stable, productive, obedient. Hive worlds rose like steel mountains, their spires choked with pollution and prayer. Forge worlds beat like mechanical hearts, feeding weapons into the endless wars of mankind. Shrine worlds rang with hymns broadcast across the void, millions of voices begging the Emperor for protection they would never receive. Billions lived there. They worked, they tithed, they worshipped, they died in acceptable numbers. From the administratum's perspective, the sector was a success. Supply lines were intact. Population growth met projections. No major heresies were recorded. No Xenos incursions exceeded tolerance thresholds. It was the kind of place Imperial strategists rarely thought about, because it did not require attention, and that was why no one noticed the warning signs. The first world did not fall in fire or rebellion. It simply went quiet. Astropathic messages stopped mid-transmission, their final fragments too distorted to decode. The administrator marked it as a communication anomaly. Such things happened constantly across the Imperium's decaying infrastructure. Repairs were scheduled. No fleet was dispatched. Then a second world fell silent. Then a third. Merchant vessels vanished along established trade routes. Patrol ships failed to return from routine inspections. Astropaths began reporting the same sensation, a pressure in the mind, like something vast shifting just beyond perception. Some described it as a scream swallowed by the warp. Others refused to describe it at all. Reports were delayed. Files were misplaced. Requests for investigation drowned beneath a billion other demands for resources and reinforcements across the galaxy. By the time the Imperium acknowledged the pattern, entire subsectors had effectively ceased to exist. Still, there was no panic. The Imperium does not panic easily. It has survived for 10,000 years by assuming that any problem could be solved with sufficient force. Rebellion could be crushed. Xenos could be exterminated. Chaos could be contained, at least temporarily. Whatever lurked in the darkness of that sector was assumed to be no different. A miscalculation. The decision was made to respond not with caution, but with overwhelming aggression. Army groups were assembled. Titan legions were awakened from slumber. Space Marine chapters received sealed orders stamped with the highest authority. The intent was clear. Whatever had taken root in that quiet sector would be destroyed so completely that no trace would remain. The worlds would be reclaimed, the tides restored, and the interruption erased from Imperial history. No one questioned the order. No one asked what had silenced entire planets without a single distress call. And no one considered that the sector had not gone quiet because it was defeated, but because something had already finished feeding. The Imperium never learned the enemy's name. That was not an oversight. It was a failure of comprehension. When Imperial fleets finally translated into the outer reaches of the sector, they found no grand armadas waiting for them. No war cries echoed through the void. No hostile signals challenged their approach. The worlds below appeared intact from orbit, their cities still standing, their atmospheres breathable, their manufactorum silent but undamaged. It looked like a system already conquered. Landing forces were deployed under standard pacification protocols. Astra Militarum regiments descended in orderly waves. Recon elements reported empty streets, power-down hab blocks, and Vox towers still transmitting, repeating the same corrupted message on an endless loop. Something between a prayer and a scream. There were no bodies. That was the first mistake. The second came when the first regiment failed to report back. Then another. Then an entire armored column vanished inside a hive city without firing a single shot. No explosions. No wreckage. Just absence. Space Marine kill teams were dispatched to investigate. Transhuman warriors bred to feel no fear advanced through darkened streets, their auto senses struggling to interpret what they were seeing. Auspex readings conflicted. Thermal signatures appeared and vanished. Motion trackers detected movement where nothing could be seen. Then the first Astartes died, not in glorious battle, but suddenly, violently, torn apart by something that refused to reveal itself. Helm cams captured only fragments, distorted shapes, impossible angles, shadows moving against the light. The recordings ended in static and screams that even enhanced physiology could not suppress. Commanders demanded clarity. There was none to give. The enemy did not announce itself. It did not claim territory or issue demands. It did not fight for ideology or conquest. It moved through the sector like a sickness, consuming populations, stripping worlds of life, and leaving behind structures that looked untouched but felt wrong, as if reality itself had been hollowed out. Imperial doctrine relies on identification. Know the enemy, categorize it, apply the appropriate solution. This enemy refused categorization. Some believed it was Xenos. Others whispered of warp entities. A few commanders, now long dead, suggested something far worse, an intelligence that learned from every engagement, adapting to Imperial tactics faster than strategies could be revised. By the time the Imperium realized it was fighting something that fed on predictable responses, it was already too late. The enemy began to strike openly. Entire front lines collapsed in minutes. Defensive emplacements were overrun without breach marks. Vox channels filled with overlapping distress calls. Different regiments screaming the same warnings at the same time, as if the nightmare were repeating itself across multiple worlds simultaneously. The war was no longer contained. What had been a silent infestation became a sector-wide catastrophe. And still, the Imperium escalated, because it always does. More troops were committed, more worlds were fortified, more blood was poured into the grinder, each sacrifice justified by the belief that overwhelming force would eventually bring victory. They did not yet understand the truth. This was not an enemy that could be beaten quickly. It was an enemy that thrived on attrition. And Imperium had just offered the greatest feast in its history. At first, Imperial High Command believed the war was turning in their favor. Reinforcements arrived in overwhelming numbers. Fresh Astra Militarum regiments replaced the dead almost as quickly as they vanished. New battle plans were issued. New doctrines drafted. The Imperium does not adapt quickly, but it compensates with scale. Where subtlety failed, raw force would prevail. And for a brief, dangerous moment, it seemed to work. Several worlds were declared reclaimed. Enemy activity diminished. Vox traffic stabilized. Commanders reported successful purges of hostile zones, supported by orbital bombardments that scoured entire districts down to molten rock. Flags were raised over cities that had been silent for months. The Administratum resumed tide projections. Victory estimates were circulated. These reports were lies, though not intentional ones. What Imperial forces had destroyed were not strongholds, but leftovers, residue, echoes of something that had already moved on. The enemy had not been defeated. It had merely withdrawn deeper into the sector, allowing the Imperium to overextend itself, to commit more men, more armor, more faith into carefully prepared killing grounds. The counterstroke came without warning. On 3 worlds simultaneously, Imperial positions collapsed within minutes. Defensive lines vanished as if erased. Entire brigades were swallowed in darkness, so complete that even orbital augurs failed to register the loss. Command posts went silent mid-sentence. One moment, officers were issuing orders. The next, only screaming remained. Space Marine chapters launched counterassaults with characteristic fury. Drop pods fell like meteors. Thunderhawks screamed through poisoned skies. Astartes tore into the enemy with bolter and blade, carving through shapes that should not have existed, fighting foes that did not bleed as they should or died when killed. And still they fell. Veteran Space Marines, warriors who had survived centuries of slaughter, were overwhelmed, dragged down not by numbers alone, but by inevitability. Every victory cost too much. Every advance was paid for in brothers who did not rise again. Apothecaries fought and died trying to recover gene seed from bodies torn beyond recognition. The casualty list grew too long to read aloud. Imperial commanders responded as they always had. They demanded escalation. Titan legions were unleashed, god machines striding across hive cities, their weapons reducing kilometers of urban sprawl to glowing craters. Entire continents were reshaped in hours. The sky burned. The ground cracked. Millions died without ever seeing the enemy responsible for their execution. Still, it was not enough. For every world cleansed, 2 more fell silent. For every enemy annihilated, new horrors emerged, better adapted, more resilient, more familiar with Imperial tactics. The enemy learned faster than the Imperium could bleed. By the end of the first year, victory projections were quietly withdrawn. By the second, casualty figures were classified. By the third, the truth was undeniable. This was no longer a campaign. It was a war of attrition the Imperium could not afford to win. And yet, retreat was never considered, because to withdraw would mean admitting failure. And failure, in Imperium of Man, is heresy. The war had escalated beyond comprehension. The first campaigns had already drained regiments and shattered Space Marine chapters, but now the true horror revealed itself. Entire hive cities became crucibles of slaughter, their spires and corridors filled with a maelstrom of fire, smoke, and bodies. Titans strode like living fortresses, their weapons pulverizing streets and fortifications alike. Yet even these walking gods were tested beyond design. Nothing in Imperial doctrine could have prepared for the scale of destruction, and the enemy thrived within it. At the Battle of Calvaris Hive, a single engagement lasted 7 standard days, though time itself seemed to stretch and collapse under the weight of violence. The enemy emerged not as soldiers, but as embodiments of war itself. Shapes that struck from shadows, dissolved and reformed, evading every tactic the Imperium relied upon. Guard regiments fell to nearly a man, consumed in corridors that once teemed with life. Space Marines fought like angels of wrath, yet even their bolters and chains words tore through only fragments, as if the enemy existed both everywhere and nowhere at once. Orbital bombardments could level entire districts, yet the enemy adapted. Underground networks, warp-twisted tunnels, and labyrinthine hive structures became hunting grounds. Cities were repeatedly reclaimed only to be lost again, their walls soaked in blood. The smell of charred ceramite and scorched flesh became so thick that even Titan's filtered systems could not eliminate it. Commanders on the ground realized, too late, that they were fighting on the enemy's terms. Casualty lists became incomprehensible. Regiments that had fought valiantly one hour vanished the next. Chapters were reduced to handfuls of survivors, their gene seed barely recoverable. Entire planetary populations were sacrificed in an attempt to suppress the enemy, but for every 1,000 lives lost, tenfold horrors emerged. The Imperium's victory was measured in body count, yet the enemy's resilience rendered every triumph fleeting, a hollow moment before more bloodshed. Even the Emperor's most devoted soldiers began to question doctrine. Apothecaries wept silently over broken bodies. Commanders burned with frustration and despair, forced to choose between tactical advantage and the human lives they were sworn to protect. But the orders were clear: annihilation at any cost. Retreat was forbidden. Mercy was heresy. Humanity itself was expendable. By the end of these campaigns, what remained were scorched planets, shattered cities, and the faint, lingering cries of those who could not be buried. The enemy had been pushed back, but only temporarily. The Imperium had won, in the narrowest sense of the word, yet at a price that would haunt it for millennia. Every victory was soaked in blood, every triumph carved deeper into the soul of humanity. This was not war. This was a mechanized apocalypse of the Imperium, a proof that even in victory, mankind's cost could never be measured, and it was only the beginning. The line between victory and annihilation had already blurred, and now it ceased to exist entirely. Imperial forces had pushed the enemy back in some sectors, but every advance was paid for in lives beyond counting. Entire regiments of guardsmen were swallowed in moments, swallowed by streets that seemed to move and shift beneath their feet. Drop pods carrying Space Marines slammed into hive spires, only to emerge shattered, the warriors inside reduced to fragments of gene seed and armor. Even the Emperor's angels could not hold against a foe that seemed to anticipate every move, strike every weakness, and exploit every human flaw. Civilians, once protected by doctrine and distance, were no longer incidental. Hive cities became crucibles of slaughter. Streets ran with blood, alleys became funnels for the dying, and spires of steel and stone were transformed into coffins for millions. Imperial commanders, trained to measure acceptable losses, found themselves unable to quantify the destruction. Reports were reduced in numbers, sterile and meaningless. Yet each figure represented a life extinguished, a family erased, a world scarred beyond recognition. The Imperium's response was simple: escalate. Titan legions were unleashed in full fury. Entire planetary surfaces were bombarded into molten wastelands. Cities were razed to prevent enemy holdouts. And yet the enemy adapted. Burrows, hidden fortresses, and warp-twisted sanctuaries emerged from the ashes of destruction, striking where Imperial forces least expected. Every victory became temporary. Every victory demanded more blood. Space Marines began to disappear. Chapters once proud and mighty were reduced to handfuls of survivors. Their losses were recorded, but carefully, selectively. No one outside the high command was permitted to see the true scale. Officers who questioned orders were removed, reassigned, or executed. The soldiers themselves carried memories too horrid to speak aloud. For them, victory was no longer a word of pride. It was a curse. And yet, the Imperium pressed on. Retreat was unthinkable. Withdrawal would have meant admitting weakness, and weakness invited the Emperor's judgment. Doctrine demanded survival at any cost, but survival had become indistinguishable from slaughter. Every conquered city, every purged world, every dead soldier contributed to a tally that would never be revealed to the public. The truth was too monstrous for Vox channels, too obscene for record keepers. By the time the High Lords of Terror were briefed on the outcome, the war had already claimed billions of lives, shattered Space Marine chapters, and left entire planetary ecosystems uninhabitable. And still, they called it victory. The enemy was destroyed, and the sector remained under Imperial control. That was enough. In Imperium, victory is not mercy. Victory is not justice. Victory is survival. And in this campaign, survival required slaughter the likes of which the galaxy had never seen. The cost was humanity itself. By the time the smoke cleared, the Imperium had counted its successes. And in those numbers lay a truth too vast to comprehend. Official reports listed tens of millions dead, civilians, guardsmen, and even space marines, but the reality was far worse. Entire regiments, from frontline infantry to armored divisions, had been swallowed in moments, erased so completely that their existence became a footnote, then a rumor, then a secret whispered only in the shadows of command bunkers. Chapters of Space Marines, once storied and proud, were reduced to handfuls of survivors, their fortress monasteries silent, except for the weeping of apothecaries and the quiet maintenance of broken relics. Civilians bore the brunt of the slaughter. Hive cities that had once pulsed with life were hollowed out. Streets ran with blood. Spire districts were leveled under orbital bombardment. Every act intended to secure the sector required human sacrifice in numbers that made even hardened commanders flinch. Yet the administratum's ledgers made no mention of the living burned, the starving, the sick. Only the enemy counted. Only the victory mattered. Executions followed, not of the enemy, but of those who knew too much. Officers who witnessed atrocities, scribes who kept unofficial tallies, apothecaries who could account for missing gene seed. All were quietly removed. Some were sent on special missions, that never returned. Others simply disappeared from records, as if they had never existed. The Imperium does not tolerate knowledge that undermines a narrative. In war, the truth is expendable, and those who hold it are liabilities. Even Space Marines were not immune. Chapters that survived were ordered to purge remaining traces of the enemy with ruthless efficiency, sometimes targeting the same populations the enemy had already devastated. Surviving soldiers carried silent guilt, haunted by the faces of civilians whose deaths were deemed necessary for the greater good. Battle honors were awarded, yet each medal was soaked in blood no ledger could ever capture. The casualty numbers themselves became a weapon of concealment. Vox reports, orbital scans, and surviving correspondences were altered. Worlds that should have appeared depopulated were recorded as stable. Deaths were reclassified as combat losses. Entire campaigns were sanitized in the archives. Scholars centuries later would see only numbers, clean, orderly, convincing, never the chaos, the screams, the scale of devastation. And yet, beneath the veneer of order, the universe remembered. Veterans of the campaign spoke in whispers, in quiet halls and empty corridors. Patrols reported ruins still haunted by echoes. Some claimed shadows moved where nothing lived. Warp-scarred worlds carried residue of the slaughter, bending reality into nightmares. The Imperium had won. The enemy had been destroyed. But humanity had paid a price that no record, no victory report, and no official history could ever account for. Victory had a cost, and that cost was the soul of the Imperium itself. The Imperium does not define victory by compassion, by morality, or by survival. It defines victory by control, by dominance, by the undeniable fact that the enemy no longer exists. That is why, despite the staggering loss of life, the shattered regiments and the ruined worlds, this campaign, this massacre, was recorded in the archives as a triumph. High Command looked only at outcomes. The sector remained loyal. No hostile Xenos presence lingered. The tide flowed once more. Warp signals stabilized. On paper, humanity had endured, and in the Imperium, that is all that matters. Every act of brutality, every civilian lost, every shattered chapter of Space Marines was justified in the cold calculus of survival. Truth was subordinate to necessity. Justice was subordinate to survival. Humanity itself, in its fragile form, was subordinate to the will of the Emperor. Records were rewritten. Casualty lists were sanitized. Survivors were reassigned or silenced. Any trace of the true horror was removed, not because the Imperium feared exposure, but because exposure would weaken faith. Faith is the Imperium's greatest weapon. Faith is a shield against despair, the glue holding 1 trillion worlds together. Without it, even the Emperor's soldiers falter. And faith cannot endure when the truth of victory is worse than defeat. Yet, within the Emperor's bureaucracies, the designation of success served another purpose. Deterrence. Worlds beyond the sector were shown the consequences of resistance. Governors, planetary magistrates, and even other chapters of Space Marines understood the implicit lesson. Disobedience, hesitation, or failure could result in extermination at the hands of their own Imperium. Victory, no matter how bloody, reinforces obedience. It enforces fear. It ensures survival through terror. To those who survived, the logic was almost incomprehensible. Entire regiments erased, billions of civilians dead, Titans lost, Space Marine chapters shattered. And yet, the Imperium seal approval remained. The campaign was a victory because the enemy was gone, because the sector remained under Imperial control, because humanity had endured for another day. Everything else, lives, morality, the very soul of the population, was expendable. And so, the galaxy remembered the war not as a tragedy, not as a massacre, but as a victory. Statues were erected, honors distributed, reports drafted. A veneer of triumph concealed the rot beneath. Those who knew the truth were silenced. The rest continued to sing the praises of a campaign whose cost could never be spoken aloud. In the Imperium, victory is measured not in what is saved, but in what survives. And on this occasion, survival came at a price so high, so incomprehensible, that the very notion of humanity itself was forever altered. The Imperium had won, but in doing so, it also revealed a terrifying truth. Sometimes, survival is the greatest atrocity of all. When the guns finally fell silent, the galaxy was left with a haunting emptiness that no tally could quantify. The world that had survived were scarred beyond repair. Hive cities, once teeming with life, had become mausoleums of ash and twisted steel. Spires of manufactorum stood jagged and broken, like the jagged teeth of some gargantuan, deranged predator. Streets were strewn with the remnants of both enemy and human, so intermingled that it was impossible to distinguish friend from foe. The very air carried the smell of blood, ozone, and burning ceramite, a stench that lingered for decades in the memory of those unfortunate enough to remain. Survivors were few and hollowed. Guardsmen who had escaped the front lines wandered like ghosts through the ruins, their minds fractured by the endless carnage. They spoke in murmurs, recounting shapes that should not exist, screams that should not be heard, and corridors that seemed to move when no one watched. Some claimed the enemy had left a mark, a residual echo of the warp, infecting the land itself. Fields of ash whispered in the dark, and rivers ran with unnatural reflections, glimpses of impossible forms beneath the blood-stained waters. Space Marines who survived returned to empty fortress monasteries, their brothers gone, their relics broken, their gene seed nearly spent. Apothecaries buried what they could, but many remains were too corrupted or desecrated to save. Those who questioned the morality of what had occurred were silenced, through reassignment, incarceration, or death. The Imperium cannot afford to dwell on horror when it threatens a faith that binds its people to the Emperor. Entire planetary populations had been sacrificed in the name of survival, and yet the galaxy would never know. Reports were redacted, casualty numbers sanitized. Official histories proclaimed the campaign a triumph, a shining example of Imperial might. Yet on the ground, in the streets, and in the warp-shadowed corners of the sector, the truth remained. Billions had died, worlds were uninhabitable, and the enemy's influence, though broken, lingered like a stain on reality itself. Even centuries later, patrols reported the uncanny, whispers in empty corridors, shadows that move without cause, and an oppressive sense of being watched. Some worlds resisted recolonization, their environments poisoned not just by radiation or toxins, but by memories, an imprint of the horrors that had unfolded. Scholars who studied these sectors reported statistical anomalies, warp-tainted energies, and historical discrepancies that could never be reconciled. Victory had been claimed, the enemy destroyed, and the sector reclaimed. But the Imperium paid a price far beyond recognition. Humanity endured, yes, but the soul of the sector, the memory of the slaughter, and the psychic scars embedded in survivors ensured that no one would forget. The echoes of this campaign haunted the galaxy like a wound that refused to close, a testament to the terrifying truth of Imperial philosophy. Sometimes, survival is a nightmare written in blood. The Imperium had won. That much was undeniable. The enemy had been destroyed, the sector reclaimed, and the Emperor's light still burned over humanity. And yet, victory had never felt so hollow. Across the countless worlds that had been reduced to ash, across the billions of lives extinguished, across the shattered regiments and broken Space Marine chapters, the price had been more than physical. It had been spiritual, moral, and eternal. Humanity had survived, yes, but at a cost that no record, no ledger, no victory report could ever justify. The survivors, soldiers, civilians, and remnants of lost chapters carried the memory of every street turned into a grave, every scream silenced, every shadow that had struck from impossible angles. They did not speak openly of these horrors, for the Imperium forbids discussion that weakens faith, yet the nightmares followed them, in quiet barracks, in ruined hives, in the depths of orbiting citadels. Veterans trembled at sounds that were not there, shadows that moved when none should. The galaxy remembers what the Imperium tries to forget. And the enemy? It was gone, or at least gone from conventional perception. Yet traces lingered. Warp-tainted zones refused recolonization. Psychic tremors whispered of the horrors that had passed. The stars themselves seemed to watch, to remember, to echo the screams of those worlds. Every calculated decision of the Imperium had delayed extinction, yes, but it had also etched terror into the very fabric of existence. High lords praised the campaign. Chapters were lauded. Tides flowed once more. On paper, the Imperium had triumphed. And yet, the galaxy understood something the reports could not convey. Victory in the Imperium is not measured by justice, morality, or preservation. It is measured by survival alone. And survival, in the 41st millennium, comes drenched in blood, carved into bone, and whispered across lifetimes of suffering. This campaign, the bloodiest in recorded Imperial history, was not a lesson in heroism. It was a warning. It was proof that the machinery of mankind's survival is indifferent to the lives it consumes, to the horrors it enables, to the innocence it annihilates. The Imperium preserves itself at any cost, even when that cost is a humanity it claims to defend. And so, the galaxy turns, billions of souls sacrificed, countless worlds scarred, and the Emperor's banner still raised. But in every victory, every triumph, every ledger entry declaring success, there lies a question that will never be answered aloud. At what point does survival become its own horror? At what point does victory, soaked in the blood of billions, cease to be a blessing and become the greatest atrocity of all? History will call it victory. The Imperium will celebrate it. Statues will rise. Honors will be granted. Reports will declare success. But the truth, the unspoken, haunting truth, is simple and terrifying. Humanity survived, but in doing so, it lost something it will never reclaim. Victory had come. Humanity endured. But the cost was the soul of the galaxy itself.